Before we begin today's episode, first I would like to say major thank you to all of our patrons. Your support is deeply, deeply appreciated. If you want to interact with them or become a patron yourself, you can do so over at www.patreon.com/pixelprojectradio. Second, I would like to put a plug in for our Discord server. You should consider joining. It's free, and it's the best way to keep up with the community as well as keep up with the show. That's where all of the newest show updates will come first. You can interact with all of our wonderful fan base, as well as me, have discussions about games, life, whatever you'd like. Along with info for the Patreon, you can find info about the Discord server in the episode description. So without further ado, let's dive into one of my personal favorite JRPGs, Xenosaga Episode I. Welcome back to Pixel Project Radio, the video game discussions podcast where we do deep dives and analyze all of our favorite games and some of yours too. My name is Rick, I'm your host, and today begins the show's three-part series into Xenosaga Episode I, an ambitious JRPG from the minds of Tetsuya Takahashi and Soraya Saga, and a spiritual successor to the cult classic Xenogears. This has been something I've wanted to do for a while. This is very far from a perfect game, but it is a game that I love very much, so I'm really looking forward to this. Stick around to the end as always. You'll hear where you can find us on the internet, various social media sites, Patreons, websites, all of the good stuff. Today I'm joined by two returning guests who I'm very excited volunteered to be a part of this. I think their insight's going to be extremely valuable. Returning from the most recent appearance on the show, we've got Chris Copeland coming from the Retro Hangover podcast. Chris, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me back. I'm looking forward to talking about some Xenosaga and just what I overall thought about this game. It's been long overdue for myself to get into this, and I'm happy that you invited me to be part of this.
Yeah, absolutely. You have a lot of experience with the classic JRPGs, so I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on this kind of middle period as the genre matured into the PS2. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Definitely.
And I think your last appearance was Hades, if I'm not mistaken, which has been entirely too long. We've got Nick from Friday Night Gamecast.
That's right. Our last show was Hades, and man, that was a good time. That was a very, very enjoyable show to be a part of. So I'm really grateful to have this opportunity to jump in here, talk about Xenosaga Episode I. So very excited to kind of get into it and get our hands in the weeds with what both you, Rick, and Chris know about this title. I'm very, very excited. Thank you.
Absolutely. I've had the itch to go back and replay Hades a little bit lately. I don't know why.
Well, 2's right around the corner, so you have, all the more reason to go back there. I need to finish. I need to actually go through my 10 completion runs. So
I did one and I was like, okay,
you're like, that's
I'm
it.
Good.
That's enough.
Okay. So getting back to Xenosaga, I am curious to know your personal histories with this game, because this is not a very popular game, even within Xeno fans of Xenogears, or the arguably more popular at this point Xenoblade series. People often forget about Xenosaga. It's kind of stuck on this system that's pretty retro, although not what you might think of when you think cliche retro. It is hard stuck on that system, which we'll talk about maybe in a little bit. And it just gets overlooked, and a lot of it has to do with some of the performance of the second installment. So I'm curious, how did you two come to find this game? When did you learn about it? When did you first play it? And Nick, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, so it's funny, I've heard about Xenosaga as a series of being part of the overall Xenoverse, generally just through the JRPG zeitgeist. Like, I never really had too much in-depth knowledge of it, nor had I really had a lot of experience with other friends or people in the gaming space that had actually played this game. So it wasn't until, Rick, you came on the show and we did our fireside talks for the Friday Night Gamecast, our little winter interlude that we had in between seasons 1 and 2, where you introduced this game to me. And really, you kind of laid out a compelling argument for this title. I was very, very interested by what you had to say. And it wasn't until I dug into the wiki online a little bit and I was looking at, kind of just the mysticism that surrounds this title. I was like, wait a second, I think I actually have to play this. And, when the opportunity arose and when you asked me to come jump on the show, this was when I really decided, okay, that's it. I'm going to go ahead and grab myself a PS2, and I ended up getting the old school PS2 Slim that I had back in the 2000s as a kid in middle school. And I grabbed a bunch of titles, Kingdom Hearts 2, Grand Theft Auto Vice City, and I fortunately was able to get a really good price on Xenosaga Episodes 1 and 2 on eBay. So this is kind of really just me jumping in the deep end for classic JRPGs in the franchise. So I'm excited to learn about this. And by extension, after I'm done with this, I'm excited to go on to Xenoblade and Xenogears and just kind of get a more in-depth understanding of what those classic JRPGs did to inform the newer ones that we get to play, like the Final Fantasy 16s and the 7 remakes and all of that.
Wow, that's awesome. So you're playing on original hardware?
Yes.
Okay, that's very cool. I am as well, at least right now. I'm still kind of at a point where I could, especially if I'm skipping cutscenes, I could jump to emulation. I'm probably just going to thug it out on original hardware. Not sure what I'll do for parts 2 and part 3, but episode 2 and episode 3, I should say. But we'll get there. That's great. I'm glad to hear that you are now part of the retro collecting community.
All I have to do is get a CRT and I'm locked in.
And kiss your wallet goodbye.
Exactly. I know that's for sure.
Yeah, speaking of great collecting and CRTs, Chris, what about you? What's your history with Xenosaga? Do you remember this being released? You're a little bit older than I am, and I played this as a kid, but I don't remember it being released. Do you?
I do remember it being discussed and released, because I remember it being quite the notable release, simply because Xenogears was, even at the time, very well renowned among JRPG fans. Now, I had a very negative, I had a very negative reception towards Xenogears in and of itself when it came out during the day. So I got it when it first came out, I believe in 1998. Started playing it probably later that year, maybe in 1999. And just, I have a very negative experience with that. I don't really want to get into it. It's just, I got into a battle where I didn't have all the right equipment, didn't have a backup save, and couldn't go back to get the right equipment. And so I essentially got soft locked. So when Xenosaga was announced, of course it was interesting, because here's a Xenogears game, essentially, made by the same people who made Xenogears with Takahashi here. And it's being published by Namco instead of Squaresoft. So, like, that's interesting, and a lot of the mythos and kind of narrative renown that Xenogears had at the time was automatically already being applied to Xenosaga even before it was released. Now, in February 2003, I'm not sure exactly what I was doing game-wise. I think I was trying to be a PS2 hater, even though I played PS2 games pretty regularly. I was more into mainstream games, but in terms of my RPG digestion, I was still kind of playing the PS1 games. Life was kind of in an interesting place for me at the time. So, like, I was very heavily leaning on more retro experiences. I want to say retro experiences, but new old games, like PS1 games. I guess GameCube was very contemporary. But like my life was just in a very interesting place. I was a senior in high school during that time. I had just been declined from almost every single college I applied to, which was my fault. So I didn't know what I was going to do in my future, thinking about joining and enlisting in the military, and just home life was a relative mess. So just trying to navigate through all of that, it probably wasn't the best time for me to just pick up Xenosaga, even though I think for a lot of people that would have been kind of the optimal time. So I didn't pick up Xenosaga then, and as I kind of already inferred, I joined the Navy and left home in November of 2003. So that meant I lost access to pretty much all of my gaming capabilities until probably about late 2004, early 2005, and Xenosaga wasn't exactly on the top of my mind. So I was getting back into gaming, but even then it was really, what could I get for really cheap, or what was more mainstream niche in terms of new releases, as most young people do, especially when setting out on their own. They want the newest, best experiences, and I think we all see this just in general. But when it came to Xeno in and of itself, and when I came back around to it, it was Xenoblade that pulled me into maybe considering this game again. So I got Xenoblade, and when I went through Xenoblade, I fell absolutely in love with it. And to this day, I think it's still my number one favorite JRPG of all time. It's one of my favorite games, period, of all time. I absolutely love Xenoblade. Is it because of the narrative? I don't know. I can't really remember. It's been over a decade since I've played it. And maybe I don't want to, because I don't want to ruin those memories and just want to time capsule that about all the good experiences I had and just falling in love with that kind of RPG again and just kind of falling in love with the way that game was. But this was also the time I was falling back into collecting. And this was the time I got my Saturn and started getting into retro stuff. And then I moved back down to Florida and I set everything up and started getting more and more into the stuff. And much like Nick here, I was like, my PS2 is kind of lonely. I got a PS2 here that I can utilize. I might as well start looking at some of the games I may have missed out on in the past. And I also picked up Xenosaga 1 and 2 for relatively cheap. Flash forward almost a decade later, I still hadn't played it. And Rick is getting into collecting, and he's messaging me about finding a copy of Xenoblade. I'm going to say Xenoblade too much here. Xenosaga 3, and he shows me the great deal he got. I'm like, I gotta really consider getting into this, because I am a huge shit talker of Xenogears. There is no secret about that. I love to put that game down at every opportunity, much probably to Rick's hatred. I think I've heard him mention this on the podcast before, especially about our Discord server, where there's a lot of Xenogears hatred. I'm like, okay, I got to get to this at one point. So he inspired me to start actively looking for a Xenosaga 3 copy. And one happened to be at my local store where they have layaway. You only have to put down 25% when you do that, and then you have 3 months to pay it off. So I was like, okay, sweet. And I had a pretty good deal on it. And I picked up Xenosaga 3, and I'm like, you know what? 2024, this is the year I'm going to play Xenosaga. And I started it, and I let Rick know. I'm like, hey, finally getting to it. And that's when Rick was like, actually, we're going to be talking about this game this year. I'm like, sweet. So that's why I'm here. And that's really my personal experience with Xenosaga is I put it off way too long. It was always in the rearview mirror, but I just never really got to it. And, I'm happy I did, because now I'm here today talking about it, and I'm looking forward to that.
I do remember whenever you picked that up. And I do remember sending you that listing that I got. I took a big risk on that because there were no pictures of the disc the backside of the disc in that listing. And at the time, it was a great deal. The price has gone down, so now it would have just been an average deal. But at the time, I felt pretty good.
Oh, it was fantastic at the time, man. Highway robbery.
It worked out. And yes, I do love Xenogears. I have more of an attachment to this series for reasons that will come up during gameplay and story stuff. I am a big defender of Xenogears. I'm not mad that you don't like it. I'm not mad if anybody doesn't like it. It is very much not a JRPG that you can just recommend freely to everybody. And it's got a lot of jank to it, too. The platforming is just as bad as Super Mario RPG, to be honest. But it's still a lot of fun. And while we're on the subject of Xenogears, if folks are listening and are curious, there is no direct... How to say this? Playing Xenogears is not a prerequisite to playing the Xenosaga trilogy. It is a spiritual successor. There are recurring elements and themes. And actually, now that I think about it, I think there may be direct references to characters that we see in Xenogears, I think. But it does not, if you don't know the story of Faye and Ellie and Shitan, you're going to be fine in Xenosaga. As for me, I played this as a kid, actually. This was one that my folks just got me. They saw it. I can't imagine that I asked for this, or maybe I did. I don't know. And I played it as a kid. I bounced off of it pretty hard because I just didn't understand what was going on, and the battle system was too complicated for me, too many cutscenes. This has like Yakuza levels of cutscenes. And as a kid, I was like, the most mileage I got out of this as a kid was using the characters to play pretend with a friend of mine. And that's it. And I came back to it as an adult, and I was like, this is exactly what I'm looking for in a JRPG. It is not perfect. It is far from perfect, but it has all of the stuff that I am really interested in a JRPG. You have themes of Jungian psychology. There are major references to Nietzsche. The subtitle of this first episode is Der Wille zur Macht, which is German for the will to power, a concept put forth by Friedrich Nietzsche. There is overt overtones of Gnosticism and Jewish mysticism and Christianity and Abrahamic religions. Some of it just being used because it looks cool, some of it actually having relevance. This isn't really a spoiler, but there is a dedicated page in the Xeno Wiki for Jesus Christ. I'm just throwing that out there. He is an actual figure in one of the games. He has a character model and everything.
Like South Park?
Not as cool as South Park. Yeah, we're not finding him and hearing him in the pews going tee hee hee. Nothing quite like that. But a lot of stuff that I'm really interested in personally appears in this, and it's also a space opera. I mean, that's what this is. It's a sci-fi space opera, and I like stuff like that. It's if you like Star Wars and Star Trek, it's kind of a similar setting, and you might like this too. Before we talk, I just want to say this up front too. If you are concerned about spoilers, if you are playing along with us, the spoiler policy is always to not spoil things until they happen. So while we're going over the dev history, talking about our feelings, backgrounds, mechanics, nothing will get spoiled for you. Once we get into the story, for this episode, for part 1, we are going to go up to the point of the Realian Lab scene. You will know it when you get there, I promise. That's where we're stopping. So, anything to say before we dive into the dev history? Any final thoughts, final summaries about Xenosaga?
Nothing on my end. I think you nailed it.
Yeah, I think we're good to go.
Then let's talk about it, because this, it's funny, we're in real time, we're recording this right before Final Fantasy XIII, 2 games with some interesting dev histories. So this was developed by Monolith Soft, published by Namco, as Chris said. You can find the full credits on the wiki or on IMDb, but of note, you've got Tetsuya Takahashi sitting in the director's chair, you've got producer Hirohide Sugiura, writers, of course, are Takahashi and Soraya Saga, also known as Kaori Tanaka. That is her real name. Soraya Saga is her pen name. Composed by the legendary Yasunori Mitsuda from the Chrono series, from Xenogears, Sea of Stars. Recently he did a guest spot on, and so much more. Fantastic composer. And of course, as I forget which one of you mentioned, I think this was you, Chris, this was released in 2003, February of 2003, in both Japan and North America, roughly at the same time. I think North America came out 1 day later. This was the debut title for Monolith Soft. After the development and release of Xenogears, Takahashi became really dissatisfied with Square's business practices. He felt that all of the opportunity and the power and the money and the focus were going towards Final Fantasy, which particularly maybe felt a little bit of a sting because Xenogears was originally pitched as the original Final Fantasy VII. It got turned down because, if you know anything about Xenogears, it is heavily religious, heavily critical of religion, and they just thought that it was a little too dark and too real. They couldn't have that. So they went with eco-terrorism instead and anti-capitalism.
Because we don't want too dark and too real, right?
Exactly. I think it worked out for the best, but the development for Xenogears in and of itself was extremely troubled. It did not release in a state that Takahashi was expecting. So all of this to say, his team felt like they were being left with very, very little. So, along with Hirohide Sugiura, who did the art on Xenosaga, by the way, the two branched off and out of Square to create their own company, which was officially founded on October 1st, 1999. That's Monolith Soft. The production of the game officially began in 2000, but Takahashi had begun planning as early as 99. By the time this game released, the first episode, he had already planned the first 5 episodes out in his mind. This was originally going to be a 6-work series, but that did not happen, which we'll see. The core team was around 60 to 80 people. The development took about 2 years. The PS2 was new at the time, so there was some challenges in learning the system, learning the architecture, but it did allow him to, Takahashi that is, and his team to sort of explore what they always wanted Xenogears to look like. But here's where the troubles come in. Many of the members on the team were inexperienced and or new. This happened because they had left Square. They, couldn't just take the entire team with them. This, combined with the fact that the PS2 is new, combined with the fact that the graphics engine for the game itself, this is insane to me. The graphics engine wasn't completed until 6 months before the game's release, put a lot of strain on this development team. I know, right? Can you believe that?
I can only imagine the amount of hours that team had to do in terms of crunch to prepare for the actual launch date of this title. I mean, you think 6 months, how much testing that development team had to actually do to make sure that things were going to run and perform successfully at launch. I mean, kudos to them, for being able to actually pull off what they did.
I almost wonder why they would not allow this team to have more time. I know about crunch culture. I definitely know about Japanese work ethic and crunch culture to an extent, right? I don't live there. I'm not experiencing it. But at the same time, it's like if you only have it done 6 months prior to, especially in an age where you're just trying to wrap your mind around development schedules for like this new fully realized 3D hardware, that's insane. I think Nick makes a great point. That crunch culture had to have been hell.
Yeah.
And I would imagine, just to jump in, I think probably at this time, especially since Final Fantasy is, I mean, we can't really say new because they're at their 7th entry of it. But again, exactly like you're saying, they're still trying to the business aspect of both Monolith Soft and, of course, Squaresoft at that time are still trying to figure out, what those production release schedules are going to be like. But it's also that same business mentality that they're taking from every other area that people who are running that business end of those publishing and development entities are saying, hey, the release date is this is what you said. There's no, we've built up a marketing campaign around this date. There's no wiggle room. We can't adjust at that point. It's just, there's very, very, in what I've seen and what I've looked at, very rigid business mindset practices. So it doesn't surprise me that they said, oh, hey, they might have even asked for more time for all we know, but the answer probably was going to be no.
That's a really good point to make because if you hang around forums are still a thing, right? Today we're not just in early 2000s. So. If you hang around on the internet, talk to your friends, I mean, the common consensus for the development of this is that it failed because of things working against them, right? They didn't have the funding, they didn't have the time. Something that I think a lot of people overlook is that it simply was a mismanagement of timeline and ambition on Takahashi and Soraya Saga side too. That's just part of it. They were planning something more ambitious than Xenogears. And you can hear that in this quote that I picked up from Takahashi. Here's what he said about the impetus of Xenosaga. He says, quote, Xenogears ended up differently from how I envisioned it. So we have decided to hit the reset button and start all over again with a science fiction story, which will be presented through a series of episodes. And here's where you can tell. Encompassing the beginning to the end of the universe. That is as ambitious as it gets.
So I think, and if I'm getting too ahead of myself here, just let me know, Rick, and I'll cut short. But if you play this game, you do feel that for myself, I felt like this game was more about telling that story that Takahashi really wanted to tell. And that was something more important to Takahashi than necessarily a lot of the sum of the parts that got to that conclusion. And so all these other areas kind of felt like they were secondary and maybe not thought of as much when it came to materializing and where it needed to be, because everything setting up for this sounded like, I have this plan, I have this grand plan about where it's going to start and where it's going to end, and this is how it's going to be. And then when it really came to putting everything together, no longer under the umbrella of Squaresoft, and you're with Namco, who Yeah, they had Tales series, but that was really the only RPG experience they had where Square was much well versed in the production of an RPG series. And you have Monolith Soft, which is still getting their feet wet on top of being underneath a publishing company that was more known for arcade and fighting games. And you kind of have this recipe for disaster.
Yeah, you really do. And it's interesting that you still point out, Chris, that you can tell that it was not to speak for you, but like a labor of love. You could tell that this was something that
yes.
Takahashi wanted to tell, and Saga too. And by the way, I'm just going to correct myself now because I know I'm going to keep saying it. Soraya Saga was not just like writer number 2. Like, she was every bit as much involved in this, maybe even more so if it comes to like words on the page, than Takahashi. And she doesn't do it as much anymore, and that's a real shame because like this and Xenogears, the two of them together could have done phenomenal things given the best circumstances. But I just wanted to put that out there. But it's good that you still realize that, Chris, because Takahashi said that when this released, the end state of Xenosaga Episode I was only about 20% of what this game was supposed to be. So they cut so much.
It makes me curious what it would have been like if they had been able to get the fully realized version of what that Episode 1 would have been.
I think I've heard that Episode 1 and most of Episode 2 originally were supposed to be the first part of this whole story. Obviously, that didn't work. The 6-episode structure had to be so intensely condensed. And we're not gonna go into like the background of this too crazy deep. This show is primarily focused on analyzing the game itself and not the historical aspects. We just like to give context. But if you want more context and you want to hear, quite frankly, in my opinion, the best Xeno YouTuber on YouTube, check out the channel TJ the Emperor. Xenosaga is specifically his bread and butter. It is what he knows best. He has an amazing video series on each of these games, each an hour plus long. He's currently doing, the last I checked, a series of every single reference found in Xenogears. Just a light little project. And it's incredible. He's phenomenal. He's not like a huge time YouTuber, but he deserves to be. It's good stuff. So I would recommend go checking it out if you want to hear more about the in-depth production and dev history, things like that. We just still have a little more to talk about, though. Besides stating that fear would be a main theme in the game, Takahashi also said that, quote, "The people in this game are all living with some past put upon them, filled with regrets and unavoidable destinies. They all need to find their own identity, and they all need to find the power to go on in life. That's the desire for power I wanted to show in this story. The villains in the story are exactly the same. As the game goes on, their wills begin to clash with those of other people." Soraya Saga mentioned a little bit later in a later interview, she said, quote, "We tend to depict human characters as a strong will in a fragile flesh and blood. Cosmos, in fact, was created as a contrast to this usual depiction in their characters. Cosmos was to be a complement by being the delicate pieces of soul in an unbreakable vessel." That sounds, if you're hearing this and you haven't played it, very high concept and heady, but I think the two of you will agree that is the kind of thing we're dealing with in this game. It is it's not an overt in your face kind of game. It's subtle. You know, the example that I always give in this when it comes to like drama and storytelling is Breaking Bad versus The Sopranos. Breaking Bad is very overt. It's very dramatic in your face. Sopranos is much more subtle. You find the story and the character moments in the expressions and in the turns of phrases. Same thing here. It's a subtle kind of game, but if you're into that, you're going to love it.
Yeah, I find that all of the characters have a certain level of multidimensionality to them. And it's one of the reasons why I, definitely decided that I needed to look further into it. And I did some of the research that I did on it. But exactly like you're saying, I love this aspect of what Takahashi is talking about in terms of each of the characters needing to find their own identity. You see that, and it is readily apparent, but the way that those aspects of those core characters and their behaviors manifest itself is nuanced, and it does come out in ways that I think is is pretty refined, especially for a game that comes out in 2003. And I think, like, especially as you're saying, for folks who are listening to this first time and they're trying to wrap their mind around like how Cosmos works or how the characters do interface with each other, it is kind of apparent where they're going and where the direction it is headed. Like, it's not necessarily all on the nose, but I do think that enough of it is nuanced for me to be like outwardly impressed by the way everything was arranged, especially with the character interactions and the character writing, which, Rick, I think you do a great job of making a point of, and everything that we've looked at and reviewed together as well.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Chris, it looked like you were about to say something.
Well, one of the things I was thinking about was what Saga was saying about Cosmos and being a delicate soul in an unbreakable vessel. I think in this game, we're definitely going to see the latter. I'm not quite sure about the former, even though it's setting that up. I don't want to get into why, of course, but seeing that the interview was in 2010, there's probably a little bit more information that Saga was talking with. Yeah. So yeah, definitely the latter will be visible within this game, not so much the former, but I do think there is a setup, and I'm sure we're going to get into why within the course of this discussion.
And you bring up an excellent point. And this is something, anytime somebody asks me my feelings on this game, I think I said it on your podcast too, Nick. This is a qualified recommendation because like 80% of this is set up for payoffs that happen in episode 2 and especially in episode 3. Like there are plot beats that happen here and things get resolved, but by the end, we have more questions than answers. This is, and critics notice that too, which we'll get to. This is very much the beginning of a story. If this were, I saw on some other site, if this were being compared 1-to-1 with Xenogears, it wouldn't even be like the halfway point.
Right.
So is that a con? Maybe. I don't know. But it is something to know going into it, that you kind of have to be in it for the long haul if you really, really want to get the full scope of this work. And that will require playing 2 more games after it. It's just something to know. Let's talk all things visual, how this game looks. And I'm going to lobby it to one of you, whoever would like to start. How about you, Chris? What do you think of this game's visuals?
Seeing as I played this on a CRT with some fantastic RGB cables attached to my PlayStation 2 on native hardware, I have to say this game was absolutely gorgeous. Like, I had to, it's one of those games that you could tell was when it was going into full cinematic, full motion video, because for the opposite reason you could usually tell in the PS1 era, where the PS1 era was, oh, the graphics are getting better. But here in the PS2 era, when it wasn't running in real-time graphics, when it was running in the cinematic full motion video, I actually think it had a graphical drop in quality. I almost just wanted it to all be real-time graphics because like the colors pop, like the blackness of space is just, it's perfect, and how the contrast all compares to how they contrast with the characters itself and the backdrop of space or the environments that you're in, and just the choice of color, the character models themselves. They don't try to be too complicated, which is something I very much appreciate, which is something that it looks like the second one does. I haven't played it yet. I have no idea how much they change it, but I do know they change it. Now, it does go for that more anime look, which is something I very much appreciate, and I do think it enhances the overall visual status of this game. I just think it looks incredible. I think it looks clean. I think it looks crisp. And if they could duplicate that in the same manner on a modern console, I think you could say it would look like a very high quality indie 3D title in the modern era. I think it would feel right at home with most titles at that more low budget feel. Like it could come out as a Switch title as long as they nail the way that it looks, at least on a CRT. And it would still be completely acceptable as a title released in the modern times in terms of its visuals. I think it's brilliant looking, and I think it's definitely one of the showpieces for the PS2 if you really want to show what it could do on when it's hitting all of its cylinders.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree completely, especially considering, like we said, this graphics engine wasn't finished until 6 months before the release. That's insane to me. I've also played it on my CRTs. That they only take the basic cables. I threw it onto my computer monitors via my RetroTink on some component cables. It looks good no matter what you're doing, even without scan lines. Honestly, it does not look that bad. It kind of has a hybridization of looking aged and timeless. I kind of feel like by looking at it, they're never going to look bad. We could play this in 2032 and it's going to look good, but you'll always know this was early 2000s. You can just tell by looking at it. Whereas something like Wind Waker, for example, it's just strictly timeless. That's always going to look good. Or the Dragon Ball Z Budokai series, after they switched to cell shading in 2, it's always going to look good. But this, it's like, it is aged, but it's also timeless. It's great. And you mentioned the character models. Yes, not a whiff of Tetsuya Nomura here. At least I don't think he was part of this team. I know I would have written that down if he were. I don't think so. Well, no, he would have been at Square. What am I talking about?
Yeah. I'll just inject really quick. I know not to delay Nick's comments here, but going back to the character models lending themselves to the graphical fidelity being a little bit better, I played Final Fantasy X not too long ago. And if you want to talk about age, if you're playing it on original hardware, that's a much better example of what looks like early 2000s, because the polygon models are trying to be far more complicated in the way they're presenting. I think a lot of the more circular look to the characters, the more bubble-headed look, or just the more anime aesthetic really lends itself to being more timeless than saying something that was trying to be more realistic, for instance. So I think this is that really good middle ground in between. I think you gave a fantastic example of Wind Waker, of cell-shaded games just being timeless in and of themselves. And this sort of the CG rendered look that wasn't full CG rendered, but allowed itself to have an expression that was unique and still could hold up throughout the ages. And I think that's what really lends itself to Xenosaga looking phenomenal all these years later.
Yeah, I can only echo Chris's sentiments. Really, I feel the exact same way that the both of you do. I do genuinely believe this is timeless. Again, my experience with JRPGs in this era is relatively limited, to be fair. I just didn't have access to the resources at that point in time to have as many of those games. But when I compare in my mind to some of the games that I did play in the past, whether it was Enter the Matrix, another 2003 title, Silent Hill 3, or even Prince of Persia: Sands of Time, this holds up, and it holds up in a way that is almost elevated, because not only do the character models, as Chris said, are they bright, are they vibrant, are they kind of individualized and characteristic and very much embody who those characters are, they just feel clean. They feel clean, and I've become slowly over time more of a fan of clean and simplified art direction versus having every single pixel crammed into a page to have just absolutely engaging environmental design. Of course, it's always going to depend on what you're looking for, but with something like this, especially with me being a science fiction fan with everything that I play, this is hitting the nail on the head for everything that I'm looking for from a title of this time. And I just couldn't be happier with how it looks. And I'm really excited to kind of see where it goes from here. Of course, I know that, as Chris said, there are changes as they go later on, but I just think I'm so appreciative of this game to be as individualistic as it is to itself, with everything that they're trying to present with all of the characters and how meaningful this is to Takahashi. And for me to go back and compare this to something like Xenogears, or to go play the original Xenoblade, which is 100% on the backlog on the list. So I'm really happy that I started with this one, because it's going to be a standout in my mind for sure.
Absolutely. I'm glad to hear that you guys both kind of agree with me here. It does look really nice. The switch to the visual design in 2 was met with a lot of backlash. They kind of went away from the more anime aesthetic to make it look a little more realistic. And they also switched voice actors for several main characters as well.
Wow.
And fans
That's a choice.
Yes, it's very Chaos especially. It's very strange. And I am glad that they kind of reeled that back in with Part 3 and got some of the original voice actors back as well. Because 2 was just not it. I really prefer this first art style to all of them, even to 3 in a way. 3 does objectively look better, but the I don't remember exactly how you said it, Chris, but the more leaning into the anime style of it while still being on those sort of CG rendered, not quite like Final Fantasy X polygon models, it looks really nice and clean, like you said, Nick. The only real thing that I perpetually notice on these character models is that some of them have dead eyes, and it looks pretty creepy, particularly Cosmos. And sometimes I think that's intentional, especially with a scene that I think we'll get to today. But, you know, I don't know. It does look kind of funny. They look like dead real dolls or something.
It's something that I am curious about and that I wanted to kind of see, because I know that you both have had the chance to play Final Fantasy X and X too. Do you think that art direction might have been what they were chasing in the later iterations of Xenosaga? Or just as, I mean, obviously we were not in the heads of these creators, but I was curious.
I think they were just trying to chase something that was more popular in terms of its graphical stylings. I think you even look at a game like Grand Theft Auto that was very popular in the West, that was trying to be slightly more realistic, and just how much of a hit that was with a more realistic aesthetic. Now, I think Grand Theft Auto 3 today looks awful. I think it looks far inferior to what Xenosaga looks like, but you have to chase the trends. And if you're ambitious and you want to make 6 games, and the game isn't as successful as you probably wanted it to be out of the gate, you're going to try to look at similar things and try to be more comparative. So, like, maybe they looked at Shadow Hearts, for example, and how that game had evolved over that time. And, like, maybe that's a direction we want to go. Or you are looking at Final Fantasy X and X-2, and you're like, well, those character models, that's where the JRPG love is at the moment, and maybe we should go that direction. It's still amazing that they kind of went that way, considering that you do have a very big anime aesthetic within the Tales series, which did fall under the Namco umbrella. That during this time you had Tales of the Abyss, and what's the one on GameCube, Tales and Symphonia, that came out and were very, very anime. And for Namco, and maybe this was on Takahashi's decision as the director, that maybe he wanted to go more in the direction of what was being popular over at Squaresoft, especially with that being his roots, that could have been a graphical decision change moving forward, especially when you're thinking that, as Rick mentioned, this was something that was finalized in the last 6 months. So this may have been the easiest thing for them to do within a short period of time for a 40-50 hour game.
That plus, and the PS2, I mean, it only released in, October of 2000? So relatively brand new when they're doing this one. It makes sense that they would up their graphics game whenever they go to 2 and then 3. But otherwise, yeah, I'm pretty sure Chris is right on the money with this. I do have one more note under visuals, but I think I'm going to save it until we get to the relevant spot in the story. It just makes more sense that way. So let's talk about mechanics, because this is not a perfect battle system, but I think it'll work for a lot of people. The 2 main modes of play in this game are going to be overworld exploration and battle. Overworld exploration in Xenogames and any game by Takahashi and Saga is extremely important, because world building, and specifically building the map, is like their number one priority. And I think it's part of what draws me to their games. That's something that I've learned that I really love. I love when a world is thought out and built. I love feeling like a world exists whether I'm playing the game or not. Do you know what I mean? Some games accomplish that really well, like Lisa the Painful and Disco Elysium. Some games don't accomplish it very well at all, like Kingdom Hearts, for example. Just off of the top of my head, thinking about early PS2 games. Final Fantasy XIII, it does not feel that way to me either. But Xenogears and Xenosaga, 100%. It's phenomenal. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Overworld, it's going to be what you're familiar with. You're talking to NPCs, learning about the lore in the world, answering emails, which is true, finding loot, things like that. But let's talk about the battle system for a second. So, Chris, I know you've played Xenogears, at least enough to know the battle system. Nick, have you?
I have not.
Okay, so this will be interesting, because we've got one person who is familiar, one who isn't, and a big dope like me in the middle. So this to me, and Chris, I'm curious to hear what you have to say. It feels like a natural continuation, although a bit clumsy, of the Xenogears battle system. Do you think so?
From what I remember, it actually, if I have to remember and try to compare the two, I feel like this is a more accessible, lighter version of the Xenogears battle system.
Yeah.
I think it's more refined. If I already said accessible, I think refined is also a better word, because it's another buzzword to put in here is streamlined. It's much more easier for the player to get into it and understand it. Now, later on in the game, it can become more of a pain in the ass, especially when you have to manage all of your abilities, what those abilities mean, and the points you have to put into those abilities in order for them to become worthwhile. But definitely in the early game, when you're just getting your bearings right and you're figuring out how the game wants to behave and wants you to behave in battle, I think it's really good. I think that when you have these basic explanations for most characters, one button is a near attack, one button is a far attack, and then a combination of those two buttons, once you build up your gauge level, can result in a special attack. I think that's easy to understand, especially when you have fewer special attacks to do. And that's essentially the meat and potatoes of the original Xenogears. But this is much less obscure, I feel. Maybe I'm misremembering Xenogears. It's been a very, very, very long time since I played it. But this is something that I feel in Xenosaga was like integral into the gameplay experience, more so than Gears, just because the entire battle system directly revolved around in terms of gauge building and how much it could impact, and is supposed to impact, how you manage the battle space.
Yeah, I think that's well said. It's definitely more accessible, that's for sure. But it does get a bit more cluttered as things progress because of how the upgrade system works and how the combo system works. In Xenogears, you learn combos by doing the ones you already know, and then once you learn a new one, you still have access to all the old ones. Square, square, triangle, square, triangle, 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 square, triangle. You could do all of that. In Xenogears, you are always at most going to have a three attack chain, a 3-chain attack. You can do either your near attack, which is physical, or your far attack, which is ether-based. You can do either of those in any combination, and then you're going to be able...
Xenosaga.
Yes, did I say Xenogears?
Got it. Yeah.
Yeah, my bad.
No
my
worries.
bad. But yes, and then you'll have an option if you have enough AP to do a special attack. Now, you learn more of these as you go, but you can only assign a total of, I want to say 4 at any given time, if I'm thinking right, because you've got square, 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 triangle, triangle, square, triangle, triangle, and each of those can have an attack, a special attack attached to it.
Technically 6.
6.
But
okay.
But realistically 4, because the 6 are when you upgrade them to be on high speed.
Oh, that's
true. So then you can do like triangle, special attack, square, special attack.
That's true. So it's a little more convoluted in that way. And like Chris just mentioned, you can upgrade these to fire off quicker. You start each turn with 4 AP, and each turn you gain 4 AP. Each attack is going to take 2 AP. So if you press square, square, that's 4 AP. Your turn's done. If you press square and then wait, now you have 2 AP that's going to carry over, and the next turn you're going to gain your 4 plus 2, that's 6. Now you can do your 3-chain special. That's important because those are going to hit harder, but you also have to manage your AP. So if you upgrade your specials to be quicker, which tends to cost more, then you can fire them off faster and you're dealing more damage. That's an integral part of this system and to the success of the battle system throughout. You really need to pay attention to that. You can also upgrade the attack's power and your cooldown time. Although, if I'm being perfectly honest, I'm not sure what the cooldown time actually is.
I think it's, from what I could tell, like if you use a special attack, it would take your character longer to get back to their turn if you hadn't upgraded it. Could I tell the difference? Not really. It's harder to tell, but I didn't want to risk anything like that, especially with as much nuance and variance that there was in this battle system. I also want to point out, too, that AP is extremely critical. You can only max out at 6, by the way, for any given turn. So if you're like, well, I'm at 4, I'm just going to guard here, which the game does tell you can do. You can guard to build up your gauge to be full the next round and take less damage, but you're not going to get 8 AP. You're only going to max out at 6. And another added benefit to that, like let's say you have a character whose special attack just isn't working in the dungeon that you're in. It's always kind of good to have a character start out at 2 AP so they can max out at 6 in case you want to double up on one of your items so you could heal all of your characters, or use items, use a W item, which is what a full AP can do, in order to benefit your team in some fashion.
That's a good point. Yeah, that makes the challenge and the strategy of working with your AP that much more beneficial to paying attention to. It's not something you can ignore like in some games. You can't just mash X to attack like in Final Fantasy, for example. You have to really be thinking here. Nick, what do you think of this battle system as somebody that's coming to it fresh without like the Xenogears knowledge?
Yeah, so I think this is, jumping in off the bat, I had no idea what I was doing. And the funny thing is that I put myself on full display by streaming this game for the first time as I was playing it. So I was swinging for the fences there on that one. But no, it's not. As soon as you kind of get into the flow of what they are expecting you to do, it is not too unapproachable. Although I think that there, as we've discussed to this point, more refined systems on the way that you organize your attack, whether it's going to be a physical or ether-based attack, or, short range versus long range attack, and how your party is composed. It wasn't until later on, and of course we're going to avoid spoilers here, but it wasn't until later on you fight a boss that is way too overpowered at the very beginning of the game that I thought I was supposed to beat. It wasn't until that point where I was truly, truly challenged and had to over and over again start consuming resources, where I started realizing, oh, okay, this is how I can organize my party, and this is how we can have a system to arrange your different characters in different parts of the map and how they can be pushed back, and how you have to stagger your AP in order to use those special attacks. It wasn't until that point, but I kind of like it. And not only do I like it, I think it's really, really cool the fact that I'm playing Final Fantasy VII Rebirth at this time with their ATB system, alongside learning and kind of seeing the juxtaposition between the two, but kind of figuring out how this is very, very much a progenitor of what that system is and what they're kind of asking of you whenever you're exchanging party members as Cloud or Yuffie, or you're kind of counterbalancing your limit breaks alongside using the different summon abilities and everything that's kind of involved with that. There's just so much DNA that's pulled directly out of this franchise, which is really exciting to me. Of course, Final Fantasy is Final Fantasy, and I'm sure all of those are informed by each other all the way from, earlier on in 10 going through, our modern day entries. But yeah, I really enjoyed this. And not only, and again, kind of to reiterate how cool this is, it was the moment when I figured out they had the Augs. Is that how they're pronounced? The Augs?
Eggs.
The eggs. Oh man. It wasn't until I realized that you could get in a fucking mech in this game that I realized that this is basically just Evangelion, the video game. And I was floored at how excited I was that I could do that, especially as Shion. So it was really, really cool. And I've been having a blast with it so far.
Well, don't say that. Takahashi, when Xenogears released, everybody said, oh, this is Evangelion. And he
got
was
very
like,
upset.
He was like, I've never watched that. I don't know what that is. And it's like, come on.
Okay.
Come on.
Sure.
That's hilarious.
One question I do have for you, Nick, because you said about positioning your characters on the battlefield, because you do have the option. There's 6 slots, and you can only have 3 characters in at one time. Did you ever put any of your characters in the back row? Because I could never find a benefit to doing so.
I did not, and it wasn't, and the reason is that, in that aforementioned boss fight that I was referring to earlier, it wasn't until I realized that the characters were getting pushed back into a backwards slot, and I was doing normal melee-based attacks, that I realized none of those attacks were landing. I don't think any of my attacks were landing, even the ether-based attacks. And I slowly realized as I was looking around the battlefield, this was trial by fire at this moment, because I'm not only trying to pay attention to this, I'm trying to pay attention to my chat at the same time. And so it wasn't until I realized, oh, they're not in the forward slot, so it really doesn't make any sense for them to be back there. I even tried to mess around with moving my healer backwards at that point in time when, you kind of encounter them. them, and that didn't really have too much of an advantage as well either. So it kind of just like it wasn't necessarily useful unless you were trying to, shield someone from actually being attacked by a character, which I know that doesn't even help because they also have long range attacks. So it's, I couldn't tell you. I don't think that there was much use for it.
Yeah, because I can't even remember being able to use any attacks from the back row, whether they were long or short range.
Exactly.
The only advantage I could find is that it would benefit certain characters of other characters from the back row, and it had to be specifically tied to those characters. But then you're losing that character's ability to do any sort of offensive attacks. I was like, this is not helping me manage the battle space whatsoever or speed up my battle efficiency. So I do think that the battle system, particularly when you start to realize how unbalanced the game could be at the end of the game, that it's kind of half-baked in a lot of ways, even though there's a lot of potential there.
Well, something I was going to speculate on purely was that, particularly considering the fact that, they had such a short crunch when the graphics engine was finally delivered and they were able to like render all those assets and push it to production, I hypothesize, this is pure speculation station that we're in right now, but I hypothesize that they had plans to have more than 3 members of your team on the battlefield at one time, but there might have been integration issues, or there might have been just too much problem trying to QA that in the amount of time that they needed for release, that they just said, scrap it, we're just going to stick to the 3-person party and run with that.
Makes sense.
I totally agree about it being half-baked, man. Again, it's not perfect. It feels like a lot of the stuff that's there is not utilized as well as it could for what it actually is. And, it's serviceable. The other thing, another thing that we didn't mention is battle animations are slow. This is, if you're playing this on original hardware, battles take a while, which is honestly, that was the reason I emulated it 2 years ago on the Steam Deck, is because I wanted random encounters, especially boss battles. I don't do the speed up, but random encounters, or should I say, standard battles, because there aren't really random encounters. I needed that to be faster. Because, man, is it slow.
Especially when you're focusing a lot on your special attacks. They are very drawn out.
Yeah. Yeah, everything gets like half of an anime moment, You get time to say your move and then do your pose and shoot it off. Every time.
Yes.
But speaking of half-baked and maybe things being there that don't need to be there, there's a slot mechanic to the fighting system in this, where in each turn a different variable will be present, like ether attacks doing more, better critical, sometimes nothing at all. I just don't think this needs to be here. I don't like paying attention to it. It's not just to your benefit, it's to the enemy's benefit too. So if it's high crits that turn and it's the enemy's turn, that's going to benefit them. I just don't see why this is necessary, especially whenever you already have such a technical battle system. Why add this in? It doesn't make sense to me.
I liked it.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. And I think it goes into something that we haven't really talked about so far, which is boost. And
boost is important. Yeah.
Boost is very important. And one of the things about boost, now there is one, all of these are not created equal. Or maybe it's like Animal Farm. Maybe some of these slots are more equal than other ones. But when it comes up to like the boost one, where every single one of your attacks will increase your boost gauge by a little bit more, that's where I wanted to make sure that my battle economy was focused on. So if my characters could get into, hey, one of my characters' turns needs to be on the boost slot mechanic. And there's only, I think, there's only 4 different slots. There's the one that doubles the amount of skill points or tech points or whatever at the end of your battle, like the points that are not your experience points. It doubles that. You have your skill boost and you have your crit increase. And I think that's it. I can't remember if there's a 5th one. But knowing that rotation, particularly for one of the early bosses, is extremely important in order to get through these battles. And to know that your characters can get on that boost and manage your boost correctly so that your characters will have their turns on the correct slot mechanic is extremely important, especially again, later in the game, I know I've said this a lot of times, but especially later in the game when enemies can just kind of boost carte blanche and you just trying to manage your turns in order to take best advantage of these slots. I think it does add an element of strategy that makes battles more interesting. Can it prolong battles unnecessarily? Again, once towards the end of the game? Oh, absolutely. And that becomes infuriating, especially in the last dungeon, when I just wanted to be, I don't want to face battles anymore. Just get me to the last boss. I'm done. I will cheese it if I have to. I can't deal with this anymore, especially when I'm getting crits landed on me. But for the majority of the game, especially against some bosses, and just managing that boost economy and getting your characters in a situation where you could have a battle where you're having 6-7 turns in a row, especially if you're manipulating that system correctly and doing massive damage, and just completely lay waste to the enemy with them maybe only having 1 or 2 turns. And that's all taking advantage of the slot mechanic. So I had a blast with it if I could manage it, which wasn't always feasible, but that also kind of adds to the flavor of battle, is trying to figure out how to come from behind or put your, find a way out of a situation that isn't exactly the most advantageous. So I give a lot of credit to it. Is it perfect? I don't think it's perfect, but I did get a lot of enjoyment out of the slot mechanic in and of itself.
Just to add some context before I kick it over to you, Nick, what we mean by boosting is your characters have a boost gauge, and that's going to get filled every time you take an action. And when it's filled, if it's not that character's turn and they're not going directly next, you can hold R1 and press a button that corresponds with them to force them into the rotation so they will go next. You can interrupt enemy turns. You can make it so, like you just said, Chris, you can just have 4, 5, 6 turns in a row if you're doing it right. It's really, really clutch, and it can make or break battles. And enemies can boost too, and they will, and they'll steal your turns, and it's so annoying at the end whenever they just, I think there's one boss that actually will just undo your boost and take it from you, which is great. I might be misremembering that, but Nick, what do you think about, do you agree with Chris? Do you like the slot system?
I think it's okay. I appreciate how technical this battle system is, but for somebody who has played RPGs and JRPGs of the modern era that have learned and benefited from user experience over the course of time and have figured out ways to develop things that kind of just like gradual quality of life increases, I find the system to be a little bit esoteric. And I don't necessarily mean that as a bad thing, because of course they only had so much to learn from at the point that this game actually came out. But I think that it is very much more of an experiential process. Like, this is not something, especially for somebody like me, I can sit down at a card game and play a board game with somebody and they could talk to me until they're blue in the face about how the rules work. I won't get it until I actually play the game. And I think the same is true for Xenosaga, is that like you will learn how each of these mechanics complements each other and how they play into what will happen to your characters and how you can navigate that system and how you can capitalize on that boost system when you're playing against, stronger or heavier enemies throughout this title over the course of time by just doing it over and over again. And guess what? You will, because there are so many encounters in this game. But yeah, I think it's okay. Would I have appreciated a nice fast forward system in the actual release? Yeah, definitely. Definitely, like you said, thugging it out on the native hardware it's a little bit tough, but we'll see. I think that I'll be able to tough it out and get it through this, because Xenosaga, if I'm not mistaken, and I mean, I plan on doing some side content, but not as much, as around 40 hours. So it's not a huge commitment worth of time to actually get through. It's just the amount of that 30 to 40 hours that you want to engage with.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And hey, at least there aren't random battles. I mean, you're running into enemies on an overworld, not unlike Chrono Trigger or Persona. So that's nice.
I was pleasantly surprised at the fact that if you were paying attention, if you were able to get it right, you could dodge it. There's a lot of times where you're just not going to be able to dodge these enemies, but I did appreciate how they train you at the very beginning of this game, how you can actually navigate around those encounters. So I think that is something to be said.
Not to mention taking advantage of environmental effects where you could have like attack certain explosive items that would have different effects. Like one would shock, one would burn, one would slow them down or make it so they were silenced, so they couldn't cast any spells. And that would be if you were paying close attention to the environment in relation to where the enemy was. And yeah, that's great stuff too.
Yeah.
I want to talk about music and sound design. And I'm going to start with something that I moved from another section of the notes down into here, which I think Chris and I disagree on this based on some stuff that I heard in Chris's server. The English dub of this was done by Anime's Studios, which is some of the highest quality dubs that you see in anime. Some of them are considered better, quote unquote, than the original sub version. Anime Studios, they are also responsible for Trigun. Fun fact, Millie from Trigun, her voice actor, who I'm blanking on, but I will put in with an edit. Leah Sargent is her name. She was Millie Thompson in Trigun. She was also involved in Cowboy Bebop, Yu Yu Hakusho, Star Ocean, Shadow Hearts, and perhaps the most lofty of roles, Shrek, additional voices. Leah Sargent is the voice of Shion in this game and in the third one.
She's so
That's pretty
good.
cool.
Yeah.
They also did Ghost in the Shell and Cowboy Bebop. Pretty sure Spike's voice actor in both the English and Japanese is in this game, and much, much more. I think as a whole, this vocal performance is terrific. There's one very, very standout performance from Crispin Freeland, who plays the antagonist in this game, who we aren't going to meet today, unfortunately, because he's one of my favorites of all time. But I think as a whole, the voice acting here is, even with the lip sync issues, visually, is really quite good. But Chris, I remember you saying that you didn't think that, and now is your time to shine.
At the beginning of the game, I thought it was typical 2000 voiceover trash. I know I'm being harsh, but I'm not going to hold back. Would I be lying if I said that it held up that way throughout the entirety of the game? Yes, because I do think it gets much, much better the deeper you get into the game. But my first impression for the first few hours of this game were, oh my God, like this is right with some of the most corny, cheesy, bad voice acting of the time, but it wasn't bad enough for me to like lean into it and enjoy it. Like it was just at that level where I'm like, this is about what I was expecting. Does it? And like I said, it gets a lot better. And Rick already said that the antagonist of this game, the voice acting job for that character is just, it's phenomenal. The quality steps up considerably, but there are some characters that you do meet, and it's just like, why does this character have a southern accent and not even consistently? Why does this character have like this kind of gruff, high, low pitched voice, like they're a child, but they're also not, kind of like a typical anime child voice? And I don't want to give too much away because we're not talking about these characters today, but I just felt like there were characters where the voice didn't necessarily match the character. And I can't complain too much because, as I kind of intimated, this voice acting still hadn't caught up to being important for video games, especially more Japanese style kind of niche video games by this point in time. Anime had just found a foothold in the United States by 2003. Voice acting had just started to be something that was appreciated. If you don't believe me, go back into the 90s, all of the 90s, and listen to most of the voice acting of the time. and you'll find some real gems. I think even on the PS2, you're going to find some just absolute banger examples of voice acting. And yes, I'm being incredibly facetious when I say that, because it's bad for a very, 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 very long time. This is not that bad, but it is in that point where, like, you finally have an example, like Rick said, animes where you go to Cowboy Bebop and Trigun, and yes, those animes are very well voice acted, but it's even more of a question I would have to go back if I had to review it, because it's been a while since I've seen them. Are they very well voice acted, or are they very well voice acted compared to everything else they were released around? And I think that's kind of the situation that you're getting with Xenosaga here. And in total, it's inoffensive, but I do not think it's great by any means.
I could speak for Trigun at the very least and say it's good voice acting.
Trigun is great. Trigun is
original.
Outstanding. Yeah, the original.
Yeah.
Okay.
I haven't checked out the reboot. I don't really want to.
The new one's actually pretty good too. Studio Orange. Good stuff.
What about you, Nick? What did you think of the voice acting here?
Yeah, it's I'm not too far off where Chris is. I don't think that it's like the best that I've ever heard of this time, but it's also not the worst. I was pleasantly surprised, to be honest with you, because I even think back to Kingdom Hearts and some of the voice acting that's in Kingdom Hearts of this era, as if you can draw some of those comparisons. And as you get to 2, there are some standout performances in that game, but by and large, it is very one note. It is very kind of flat and monotone, and not very full of character and life. I think that the writing goes a long way in this game to actually like lifting up the vocal performances more so than the actual delivery itself. I think that the writing is just incredible, both from Takahashi and Saga, and I think that they did the best that they could with the resources that they had at the time. I'm a fan of all three. I'm a huge fan of all three of these anime that you have here. Who did, Ghost in the Shell is probably one of my favorite anime of that time, alongside Akira, in terms of the actual sound design in the sound direction of those titles. And I think that the music, again, in both this title as well as some of these comparisons that we have here, it goes a long way to actually kind of lifting up those performances in certain moments, in certain sections of the game. But I don't think it's by far the worst that I've heard, and it's certainly not the best. But as we go back, I think this is going to be a recurring theme, but I don't think I should be surprised, but I am continuously pleasantly surprised at how much I am enjoying it.
That's fair. I don't think either of you are off base. There are definitely some areas where it's just not great. There are more than a few instances where there are these bizarre pauses in speech where I think it's just to sync up the lips, in some attempt to sync up the lips to the audio. That's really the biggest thing that I consistently notice. And sometimes, like there's a character named Junior who sometimes is just really laying it on pretty thick with the performance, and it's like, I don't know. Shion, for the most part, is pretty good. Alan, for the most part, is pretty good.
Yeah.
Captain Matthews is just basically just calling people you moron the whole time, so that's fine.
Writing hurts him a little bit more than his voice acting, I would say.
Yeah.
In that instance, yeah.
Oh, yeah, most definitely. In addition to sound, we also have the score, which, of course, was done by the famous, extremely well-known maestro Yasunori Mitsuda. Several tracks for this were recorded by the London Philharmonic as well, which is pretty incredible. The opening is all London Phil. A lot of the intense battle and cutscene music is London Phil, but it's not just all orchestra. There are performances by the Metro Voices Choir. There's a lot of choir in this soundtrack. The Gen Itetsu strings and performances by Yasuharu Nakanishi on solo piano. So it's a pretty varied soundtrack. It is not going to reach the same heights as Xenogears, to be quite honest with you, but I still think that this is a really good soundtrack overall. There are some things that hurt it, like there's only one battle theme for everything, including bosses, with the exception of the final boss. That's the first time you get different battle music. And a lot of the time when you're exploring or walking around, there's just no music playing whatsoever. It's just ambient sounds and footsteps, which is a weird choice. But those things aside, I don't think this is a bad soundtrack. I think a lot of the tracks are really strong. There's a character named Albedo. His theme is really cool. There's a wailing tenor that sings it that makes me think of Grandpa Simpson every single time. It's all I can hear whenever I'm going to play it here. I know I am. It's very good. I'm much more of a fan this time around on the soundtrack than I was before.
I have a question for you, Rick. From a procedural standpoint, can just any composer, if they have the money, go and conduct and like do, because he did conduct at the London Philharmonic to compose this score, didn't he? Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was recorded on site. Okay. And no, not just anybody can do that.
Okay. So I mean, I'm just curious as because like it's very, very, I am fascinated by the inner workings of how music in video games, especially across countries like this works. So you can only imagine that he might have come in at a recommendation from Nobuo Uematsu or other people that he worked with at Squaresoft when he was, kind of working alongside them during the Chrono Trigger era. But I'm just curious as to, like, do you have any idea how that might work for him to go and do something like that? Or is it just he was so good because of his work that he became kind of internationally renowned for what he had done at that point?
I'm honestly not sure. I think a lot of it probably would have been handled by Square.
Okay.
Reaching out, like Square's people reaching out to the orchestra's representation. It certainly would have been necessary for him to have the status that he did, for them to consider it. Because like I said, I mean, you can't just get any composition grad student and have them get a recording with the London Phil. It just doesn't work that way.
Got it. Okay.
But it was probably Square's like legal team, or not legal team, but marketing,
their business development side.
Development, yeah. I'm not sure, to be honest.
Okay. Absolutely.
I'm not familiar with that part of the industry. So I reached out to some friends and former colleagues to get some insight about this information, and while I didn't get a concrete one-to-one, this is exactly how it happens kind of explanation, I think I did get some light shed on it. Generally speaking, this is pretty similar to movie studios and recording studios. A relationship at some point is formed, and then that's kind of just fostered along as time goes. At some point, at some time, somebody is going to know somebody from both sides of the studios, the game studio and the recording studio, or the game studio and the actual orchestra. They'll set up a meeting. That's how contracts are formed, relationships are fostered, things like that. It's certainly not something where you can go online a la Amazon, put the recording session in your cart and call it a day. It's more of a business relations kind of deal. Wasn't able to find an exact answer, obviously, but I think that provides at least a little bit of insight. I found they released this soundtrack as an OST, like they gave it a proper release. And in the liner notes, I found some really interesting comments from Mitsuda and Takahashi. I'm going to read at least Mitsuda's here. It's under the heading, "One must return to one's failures in order to have confidence." He says, quote, "Although I have worked on many video game scores as I might have expected, this time I had almost no confidence in myself. I lacked confidence because of the massive scale of the game, its high-level quality, the high expectations of those Xeno fans who have waited for so long, and because I had never composed and arranged for full orchestra before. I approached these new experiences with anxiety and a sense of the weight of my responsibilities. To be honest, this time I did not have the self-confidence to shoulder all of them. But isn't this a great chance to enter new territory, I felt, and with that expectation as my sole support, with that alone as sustenance, I went ahead and gave it a try. But as I expected, reality was not so kind." And he goes on to talk about an early piece getting scrapped, and he continues, The incident caused me to lose all of my confidence, and I felt I would no longer be able to proceed with the large orchestra recording that was to start soon. I don't know how anyone around me felt, but I had already decided that I would proceed by having someone else do the orchestration. I was running away from reality. He goes on to say how he regained his confidence and how it was ultimately a beneficial scenario for him. That's something that happens a lot that I don't know if people know about, where composers will compose the music, but somebody else will do the orchestration. It happens quite frequently. I mean, not always and certainly not exclusively, but it's something that definitely happens, especially if you are somebody that is not comfortable with working with large orchestra or, a choir or something like that.
Is that a situation where the composer will sit down with the other orchestrator or somebody who is going to be leading the orchestra and kind of explain the pieces to them, like on a case-by-case basis, just like run through it and talk about like where they wanted the emphasis to be?
It can vary. I think it just depends. Sometimes it's just you hire somebody to orchestrate and that's that.
They figure it out. Okay.
Sometimes you work with the composer to see what they had in mind. They might make notes on their score as to what they envisioned. It kind of depends on the composer.
Got it. Feel free to strike that. I'm my curiosity is getting the better of me.
No, you're good. You're good. I don't really have a ton more to say about the music. I like it. I think it's good. It's a nice mix of piano, choir, and orchestra. The London Phil obviously sounds great. I don't think it's Mitsuda's high point, but I'm not as cool on it as I was my first playthrough. Chris, I think I remember you saying that you weren't a fan of this soundtrack.
I'm not a huge fan of the soundtrack. That's not to say I think it's a bad soundtrack, but I don't think it's great. For Mitsuda in particular, I think this is one of Mitsuda's weaker soundtracks. Now that's a very high bar, so it's not like I'm saying this is terrible. You're talking about the composer of Xenogears, Chrono Cross, and Chrono Trigger, probably some of my 3 favorite OSTs of all time, and this is coming from someone who does not particularly love Chrono Cross or Xenogears. So I can appreciate what Mitsuda is able to do. But I think I even saw in this in the interview that you shared that the soundtrack for Xenosaga is 2 discs, which, as someone, when I was much younger, I got CDs, I got game OSTs on CD. Like Final Fantasy VI is, I think, 3 or 4 discs. Chrono Trigger is 3 discs. These are Super Nintendo games that have a bigger music variety and selection than this game. So maybe it's not so much the quality that's getting in the way of me enjoying this or particularly labeling this game as having phenomenal soundtrack, but it's almost like the lack of music. And the use of silence is overused. There's too much silence in this game. I think if there was some accompanying music to each of these dungeons, because most dungeons you just hear nothing except the ambient noise. And that works in a horror game, but this is not a horror game, even though there are things that are scary in theory, but that's not what this game's trying to be. So it's very eerie in a bad way, not in like an enhancing way, when there's so much silence in this game, especially when you have a composer at the talent level that is Mitsuda. I almost feel like Mitsuda was wasted here. And that's just to say, like, these tracks can be of incredible quality, but I can't really remember any of them, because I think when they're at their most pronounced, there are major plot elements happening that I'm more focused on and paying attention to than any sort of musical accompaniment that's occurring at the time. So, I love Mitsuda. I don't hate anything here. I don't think it's grating. I'm not knocking it. I'm not saying it's bad whatsoever. But what I'm saying is that the balance in which they approach this from a sound design point, in terms of what should be quiet, where there should be music at, and how to attack it at that aspect, for pretty much anything that is not a cutscene, really, I think might be why the reason you were so cool on it. I don't want to speak for you, but like I was very cool on the soundtrack as well, just because I really can't find anything that's memorable. And the battle theme is just kind of okay. And you're going to be hearing a lot of that. So at the end, like, I just, it's not that I like or hate it. It's just, I really can't remember anything in like with any sort of specificity in terms of just what it is.
That's fair. There is way too much silence in this game, for sure. And the battle music, you're right, it's fine. I have heard others say that that's never been Mitsuda's strength. I haven't played enough of the games that he's worked on to comment on that, and quite frankly, I can't remember the Xenogears battle music. I thought the Chrono Trigger battle music was good.
It's fine. I liked it too. Yeah.
I don't know. But yeah, the battle music here, especially with how often you hear it, because again, that's the only battle track for every battle, including bosses until the final boss. Yeah, I can't say that you're off base with anything there. The strengths of it, I think, come in the cutscenes where it is punctuating what is actually going on screen instead of just like dungeon music when there is music, or battle music, or the like seaside guitar strumming music whenever they want to have curry at night and relax.
Yeah, I can't say too much more than what you gentlemen have already covered. I would say that out of the three of us, I feel like I'm the highest on this soundtrack, and I think that might be because the first thing that I actually consumed of this game as a whole is that I went on YouTube and I looked up the episode 1 OST and I listened to it front to back. And so that's kind of the first thing that really hit me. And it was, honestly, I mean, there are some incredibly beautiful standouts to this game. I mean, I'm looking at titles like Sorrow, and obviously the battle theme that everybody is familiar with, but then there's also Relief, Close-Minded Girl, and Nephilim. Those tracks particularly stand out to me in a really, really big way. And I just think that there's a lot of emotion. I feel like Mitsuda composes with so much emotion, and that really is conveyed throughout the course of this game and in various cutscenes that you hit. There's a lot of, and exactly as Rick and Chris, you've both said to this point, is that there are a lot of moments where there is going to be very, very high tension or very, intense in discourse or interaction between the characters that are on screen. And it's only complemented by the score. You're not necessarily, I'm not distracted by it, but I think that it doesn't, it's hard for it to stand out on its own, especially because there's so much silence whenever you're not actively engaged in a cutscene. So it's tough to really, really judge it. And of course, me with my limited experience, I don't really have too much to compare it to. But for the things that I have experienced here, I mean, I really do love this soundtrack. And I think that's just me.
I will do my best to put in appropriate music whenever we are talking about areas of the plot that have music and not just silence. So listeners, you will be able to decide for yourself whether you are a fan of this or you think he is outdone by his other works and was maybe held back a little bit by his insecurities here. Reception, I don't really have much to say. 7s and 8s out of 10, generally favorable reviews. Folks liked the story and the presentation. A lot of critics noted the unfinishedness of part 1. It's fine. You heard us talk about a lot of that, so I don't think dwelling on it is necessary here, especially because we have a lot of story to get through. So, if you two don't have anything else to say, I think it's about time we dive in and go through the story. What say you?
Let's do it.
Let's go.
Okay. Let's jump into Takahashi and Saga's spiritual successor to Xenogears, Xenosaga Episode I. So this begins with a tagline of 20XX AD, we're at Lake Turkana, Kenya. Perfect Works, which is sort of the video game Bible. No, that's not the right term. The Ultimania of Xenogears and Xenosaga places this at 2001. Maybe a nod to a Space Odyssey based on some of the imagery we see. I don't know. I looked into Lake Turkana. I like doing this whenever video games use real places, you know? Like that place, what's it called? New York. Have you ever heard of that from Parasite Eve?
I've heard of New York.
Yeah, crazy.
I'm not too familiar with that one. You have to lay that out.
I hear they're walking there. But Lake Turkana is a lake in Kenya. It's the largest deserted lake, and deserted as in a desert, and the largest alkaline lake. And it's thought to be some of the earliest forms of human life due to the fossil records, even though the water, at least in its current state, is unsustainable to life due to its high salinity and chloride levels. So this is already really significant, if you ask me. We see beautiful crystal blue water stretching across the contrasting arid desert here. The orchestra punctuates with lush strings and shimmering winds as what appears to be an excavation site is introduced. Large teams are digging in the area, searching for something. We're introduced to Dr. Masuda, someone who seems to be the lead and is inexplicably wearing a beanie in what I assume to be wicked heat. Fashion is danger. A team member excitedly reports a find, something different from the others, he says. A crowd begins to gather. Masuda bends over and touches what looks to be an ancient, intricate symbol on the ground. He recognizes it and places a cross-like object into the lone recession of the diagram. This immediately sets off a reaction, light spreading out of the design like tendrils even deep into the ocean floor. The earth shakes, and from the sea floor bursts up a structure, some sort of base. The intense orchestra gives way to a small chamber choir, which I cannot tell if they are saying "we shall be as gods" or "we shall be found." I can't tell, but it sounds like both, which is important. A projection of what's known as the Zohar appears, and then materializes brilliant in gold, shooting light into the heavens. Rain immediately begins to pour. So the Zohar is a prominent piece of symbolism in all of the Xeno works. It's in every single Xenogears, Xenosaga, Xenoblade. It's in all of them. And it is this representation of higher power, limitless energy, and it's going to play an important role in this game too. This intro is so fascinating to me because it's taking place in this lake that is thought to have been one of the birthplaces of human life, and we don't know what the deal with this Zohar is, but it's clearly important in some way. It clearly is a fount of energy, and it may be divine because it is communicating with the heavens to initiate flooding, which can be seen as either the beginning of life or the end of life. With the desert, it could symbolize the beginning, which is further emphasized as we move 4,000 years into the future here in a second. But because of all of the heavy religious iconography, it seems pretty clear to me that this is, in some way, this is a birth of something. There's too many other variables to really dig into this, but what a fascinating introduction. I think this is so cool.
I couldn't agree more. I think that to kind of your point, though, we talk about the presence of water in this section, and they're very clearly leaning into some heavy archetypes here. And I interpreted it as a rebirth because of the cyclical nature of where they're trying to go with the Zohar, and exactly how we see things that are repeated 4,000 years later in the narrative here. But yeah, no, this is great. This is a great start to the story already.
I would also agree, but I know I'm going to kind of put a damper on this. This is where I thought the voice acting was quite horrendous when I messaged you about how bad it was. It was pretty bad here. That aside, it is a great way to kind of introduce the audience into, hey, the plot's going to have some elements that you're going to have to pay attention to, because this is kind of introducing gravity to it. I think you make a good point of it being birth or the end of life. It's definitely more of, I would agree with Nick, more of rebirth, because, I mean, you're on Earth and humans don't go away, as we will shortly find out. So, I mean, it's definitely not about the end of life. What happens after this, I don't think is necessarily revealed. I'm not sure if it is in this game. But what happens immediately afterwards, not revealed. I also I didn't really put this together, and I'm sure you're going to have more in the Zohar, because I've seen that you've been doing research on this. But I do find it funny because I did get done playing Lunar 2 not too long ago, and the main enemy of that game is Zophar. He is the big baddie, and then I don't know. I'm just tying it into a game that's very, very heavily into religion, and here's another game that uses a lot of religious iconography in a Japanese RPG. And just, how long has this kind of been going on in this genre? And that's always fascinating to me, especially when this is pulled, especially when you go back to Xenogears and everything else that goes on in JRPGs. And I think that you've said that Takahashi and Saga really get it right in these instances. So hearing what your research has dug up, I'm definitely looking forward to that.
I really think that they do a good job with it. I can't remember if we see here the symbol on the Zohar, but we're going to soon, so I'm just going to put it in now. We see a Hebrew symbol on it, and it is the symbol Aleph. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Aleph, I think it is actually.
Aleph.
And it kind of looks like a stylized X, sort of. And I looked into what this letter is, and I found this website, HebrewForChristians.com. Great. That like teaches you how to draw it. It like tells you how it's pronounced. It's a silent letter, actually, but there's meaning behind it. It is the first letter, and it is the father of the Aleph Bet, but it represents sort of the ineffable mysteries and oneness of God, and it means master or Lord. And we're seeing that on this divine object that just caused a gigantic rainstorm out of nowhere, and also materialized out of nowhere, and becomes not hostile, but it holds untold power. And I think that's very interesting. I don't know if anything comes of it, but it is interesting to note. Like, they're not just playing with random symbols here. They didn't just look up a random hiragana letter and throw it on. Well, they wouldn't do that because they're Japanese, but you know what I mean. Like, yeah. There's thought behind all of this.
It could have just as easily been alpha from the Greek alphabet. But they specifically went with Aleph from the alphabet.
And they also used the I am the Alpha and the Omega in the intro to Xenogears, so they couldn't redo that trick.
Yeah, well, no.
So we get a notification. Oh my God. We get a notice on screen 4,000 years later. We're now in space. Tim Curry's favorite place to be.
Space!
We see the Zohar floating in space, and we get a montage. It's a sort of space office setting with a team at work, and we see a red-headed lead getting into a sort of pod. And this is our main character, Shion Uzuki. Same last name as Shitan from Xenogears, by the way. Let's talk about Shion for a second. I like Shion.
I really like Shion.
She feels like a very human JRPG protagonist. She does not feel like whereas Tidus or Sora
Cloud
or Cloud. I don't know. She feels like a real person. She is not depicted as perfect.
She just has real motivations. At least at this point, where we're at in the story so far, from my perspective. I just feel like that she is drawn towards something that I think we'll understand a little bit later here, but her motivations are human, and they are based around trying to help the people that are around her, and they are based around, from what I understand at this point, to be very kind of defined, a very defined moralistic compass. And I find that really intriguing, and I honestly find her dialogue relatively relatable. She's somebody, I actually have it in my notes here. I really like how dauntless she is. She's not scared to take action, and she's not scared to fail. And that's something that you don't necessarily see from female protagonists at this time, especially in 2003 when you're writing characters like this. So I thought that she was definitely a standout.
At the beginning of the game, I 100% agree with you. I think she's a great character here. I'm not going to speak much onto that because we're going to be moving through. There are things about her that do start to grate on my nerves, particularly as pertains to another character in this game, and I will detail that when we get to that. But for this moment, I think that both of you, particularly Nick here, just really nail it in terms of my perspective as well, especially when you start I don't know if I'm going too far ahead here, but moving around in the environment you're shortly about to be moving around in, and the perspective that she provides, especially towards a certain type of humanoids, and their relationship to the world at large and how they fit into the world, into the lore and everything like that. And her perspectives really flesh her out as a character, especially how they contrast to another character, and how she compartmentalizes that or compares that, or how the player can. I think that's an extremely important part of her character and how she develops and how she navigates through this world and how she kind of comes to terms with everything that's happening. Does it really necessarily go that deep? No, but you can tell that there's a lot of building going on here towards bigger ideas, and especially for the character that she contrasts against. That, of course, I'm being very vague here because we're not there. As Rick said, we're not going to spoil anything until we get to it, so I'm trying my best. But in terms of her entire character, I think that, as Nick said, she's the kind of character that really takes charge. And you did not see that from female protagonists, being this direct, being this assertive in these sorts of environments. And you really don't even see a lot of that today, let alone back then, especially back then. So having that kind of female protagonist in that sort of role is a very unique thing that you have in gaming at large. And that does make her an appealing character throughout really video gaming, let alone the RPG space.
We're going to be talking about her a lot because we spend a ton of time with her. So I'm going to hold off for a little bit. And because I want to push us through some of this, as much as I would love to do like a 10, 12 part series, and I'm not joking, I really would. I can't do that to people who have their own shows and lives. Right now, Shion is getting into a pod to test out this project that she's working on named Cosmos. We're going to meet her in a minute. Her team is counting her down and monitoring her vitals as she goes into this encephalon, which is basically just a virtual reality nervous system. And as she's being counted down, we also see this brief scene of 2 drones in space securing the Zohar and an astronaut touching it, and he immediately vanishes. Mm-hmm. So that's setting up some mystery. Again, this thing is power beyond our comprehension. And speaking beyond our comprehension, something that's easy to miss here is Shion's password as she goes into her computer is "Ye shall be as gods." This was in Xenogears too. And we're about to learn this, so I'm just going to say it now. Shion, one of her character traits is she very much wants robots and these robot-human hybrids called realians to be treated as real people and to have the emotions of people. This game deals a lot with the difference between robots and humans, this group of machines in between called realians that are a little bit of both. It brushes up against human rights issues. So we're going to hear a lot about that from Shion, but I wanted to read the passage from Genesis this is from, because it has implications to exactly that point. Here's that passage. Now the serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said unto the woman, Yea, hath God said, Ye shall not eat of every tree of the garden? And the woman said unto the serpent, We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God hath said, Ye shall not eat of it, neither shall ye touch it, lest ye die. And the serpent said unto the woman, Ye shall not surely die. For God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. The serpent is being the rational one here, if you ask me. I'm not going to elaborate more on that, but this is from the fall in Genesis, the King James version that was, and that has a lot of implications for what we're going to be dealing with in this story, this idea of forbidden knowledge, and what does it mean to know what you are not meant to know, and to ascend beyond humanity into the realm of the gods. We're going to deal with this a lot, and there are even more specific call-outs of biblical characters in this game.
Rick, I don't want to get too far ahead once again, but I think it was it Nietzsche, and there's a lot of these things in here that pretty much said that God was dead and mankind replaced gods.
Yes.
And from what we understand is that Takahashi and Saga took a lot of influence, not just from Jung, but also from Nietzsche in that application. So when if you know going into this, I don't want to say that they definitively did. So if I'm wrong here, please correct me. But if you go into the understanding that there is some philosophical Nietzsche beliefs about, and you apply that to the ye shall become as gods, and you're coming from the perspective of a philosopher that had the belief that mankind killed God in almost a lamentation, but then mankind became God in and of itself, was worshiping itself, then that adds a host of depth to what that could mean in the situation.
Yes, good pull. And you're right, that was Nietzsche from his work, The Gay Science, which I totally did not just Google. I'm not going to try and spout off of the dome of what Nietzsche meant by the God is dead turn of phrase that he used. But broadly speaking, you are right. It is this idea that we begin to move away from the mystical and turn more to our everyday lives. And in that sense, God is dead, and it is us who have killed him. All of this is playing in together. Takahashi and Saga knew this stuff, and that's why they are so good at implementing it in here, to the point where they use biblical names and creatures like Nephilim and Seraphim and other characters like Febronia from history, like the saints. We see all of this in here, and it's not just like with Persona, where they just use it as a little like, hey, we know this. They actually use it in a way that makes sense. There's so much to talk about with this stuff. It makes me wish that I, was smarter and knew this stuff a little better to talk about it. It's really interesting. But for right now, we don't know the context of any of this. We've seen this on the screen, and we're drawing these conclusions from the divine nature of the Zohar that we've seen so far. Once we're booted up into this encephalon, this is where we meet Cosmos. She is a humanoid, or maybe it's more appropriate to say physically identical to a woman, robot, designed as an anti-gnosis weapon humanoid fighting system. So, Cosmos. Are we tired of the robot trope in JRPGs yet? I'm not. I'm asking the room.
I'm certainly not.
No.
I'm certainly not. No.
Okay. Because this was kind of in Chrono Trigger 2 with Robo. Like, can robots have the capacity to feel? I guess in Persona 3, it's there. It's there a lot. I don't mind it. It's a big theme in this one because, like I mentioned, Shion really, really wants Cosmos to essentially be like a child to her. And that's kind of how she treats her. Whereas Cosmos will say things like, sadness is not an emotion that is necessary at this time. Another great thing that she says is, Shion's like, oh, I'm so sad that we only wake you up for testing, or the worst possible scenario would be bloodshed. And Cosmos will say, the algorithms I have been programmed with do not support the comprehension of illogical human thought.
I think what's important here is what I was talking about Shion before, is that if you walk around the ship you're on, which I can't remember the name of at the time, you can tell she very much views these, I want to call them cyborgs, but these artificial humans as full-on humans, and that they have rights and they have feelings and they have beliefs. And at this point right here, she's trying to put those feelings into Cosmos, as you see that she's her child, she's her creation. But instead of acting like a human like the Realians do, Cosmos is acting like a robot, even though she wants her to act more like a Realian. And that will be different very shortly, which is something I want to get into when we get to that, because I do think it's important towards Shion's character development.
Yeah. And by the way, the name of the ship is the Woglinde. The Woglinde?
Woglinde.
Yeah. So
yes, fans of Wagner will know.
But I find this, like, the idea of the relationship between Shion and Cosmos at this point really fascinating, because, as you said, Rick, she is treating her very much, Shion specifically is treating Cosmos very much like a child. However, I find it more interesting up until this point that she and Alan specifically, if I'm not mistaken, have a very pointed conversation about the way that they want to treat her once she is awakened, because she up until this point has not been awakened yet, and there are a certain amount of testing that is occurring to make sure that she's going to be a fully operational weapon by the time they need to use her against the Gnosis. And I do find that if I'm not mistaken, and I don't necessarily have this written down or picked out, but I do remember that Shion had a certain amount of anxiety about making sure that she's not putting her traumas, or she's not transferring her anxieties into Cosmos, because she is, for lack of a better word, just a child to her. But I also find this like weird diffusion, I feel like, between this self-awareness of Shion versus the way that she actually treats Cosmos once she wakes up. And maybe that's a real thing. I mean, maybe that's intended by the writers, because I'm not a parent, but I can imagine as a parent you have all these ideas of how you're going to behave once you have kids, and then that completely gets thrown out the window once you actually have kids, and you have to perform as a parent in an operational capacity, whether that's being thoughtful or being under fire. And at this point, they're very much in a time of stress.
What you're identifying with Shion towards Cosmos is very much justified. I will say that.
Okay.
That's what I will say.
Okay.
There is an extreme amount of justification of Shion's concern and the way she is treating Cosmos and why she is doing it. That will definitely be discussed later.
Okay. Okay. It's interesting.
But there is a justification towards it. Absolutely. Like they're setting everything up as it needs to be set up.
Yeah, it's at this point we should have questions. That is kind of something just with this whole episode 1. You've got to be comfortable with not knowing everything most things at any given time, I would say.
Right.
And then once the game is over, like 60% of what's going on, and then it gets recapped in part 2. Cosmos, by the way, is a Greek word that means order and arrangement. Cosmos is also all caps, whereas chaos is all lowercase. This is intentional. Takahashi and Saga conceptualize these two characters from the beginning.
And gnosis, of course, meaning knowledge.
Yes, that is interesting. I'm glad that you brought that up. The gnosis are the primary enemies in this game. They're like these weird fish-looking alien creatures that can somehow also wield guns, which makes me laugh every time.
Yeah.
And yes, gnosis does mean knowledge. It is like it's rooted in Gnosticism, right? That mystic sort of kind of Christian adjacent mystical religion about the demiurge and the seeking of knowledge to become one's own god. I haven't figured out how that works with the gnosis, right? There's another podcast, Resonant Arc, that I'm a big fan of. I say that all the time. We almost worked together and it didn't work out, but they were positing on their show about this, that maybe this is something to do with the fighting against knowledge and being afraid of knowledge, but I don't get that from the gnosis in the game. I don't know why. I don't know why they're named that.
I'm just gonna take a stab at it and kind of say here, because I did have some notes relating to Gnosticism, because I felt like that was a prerequisite to jump into this conversation. But from what I understand, a lot of the Gnostic writings and the texts of that kind of proto-Christian era, in at that point in time with Greece and all of those early Aramaic civilizations, is that they actually dealt with they opposed the idea of sin and repentance being integral to the idea of the spirit, knowledge of the spirit, and they actually focused more on the differences between illusion and enlightenment. And I think that if I'm getting this right, is that the idea of that the understanding of the greater power was more important to the people who followed these ideas of Gnosticism, more so than actually understanding like what that power actually means or how they're supposed to live their life. It's like this idea of trying to remove like the illusory nature of living in the material world versus actually having understanding of that greater and lesser spirit. And that's what's going to lead ultimately to enlightenment. And I find it really interesting that the gnosis don't exist on the physical plane, and that's why they can't be attacked prior to...
They must be brought in by humans.
Exactly.
To be interacted with.
Exactly. And so that's kind of like what I'm imagining, is that the gnosis are existing not in the material plane, and it's potentially because they're kind of a symptom, or maybe they're a relic of this higher power that is existing because of humanity's knowledge. I'm getting a little bit in the weeds here on this one, and this is very much an early stab at this understanding, but I do know for a fact that because the Gnosis don't exist on the material plane, and that Shion and the team has to use Cosmos to bring them in to fight against that, that's probably why they're aptly named that. It's because they can't be harmed, because you can't perceive them.
And there's also the event that ties into when the Gnosis are released, which you find out much later within episode 1. When that happens and what causes that would probably back up your theory. I also think it's interesting that, from my understanding, we said already the word Nephilim, which is an important word that we will be saying much later as well. I think that concept of what a Nephilim is doesn't really come up in the original Old Testament too much. I might be wrong here, but I think it is prevalent in the Gnostic Gospels. Gnostic Gospels, of course, containing books famously that would be like the Book of Enoch. That is a Gnostic Gospel that is not included within the Bible proper. That was excluded back when they were picking which books could and could not be in the Bible for integrity or whatnot. I forgot the name of the convention of which decided those books,
and it's very interesting when you know what is in the Book of Enoch as to why they decided to leave it out.
Yes. And so when you're thinking of this, and I don't know if that gnosis, in the word Greek meaning knowledge, of course it does tie into Gnostic, and I think it is very deliberate that the relationship between the two, Gnostic Gospels, Gnosticism, and how they were pretty much excluded from the Christian church in the beginning for their beliefs, and especially tying into the stuff like the Gnostic Gospels and so on and so forth. This is all very deliberate and intentional. And there's layers of depth. There's layers and layers of depth that right now, in terms of narrative, we're just scratching the surface in the most elemental of ways.
Yeah, it's going to be really cool to see this play out and continue to come back to your interpretation, Nick. I want to move us through some of this stuff pretty quickly, though. We're going to go through our first mini dungeon here. This is the tutorial dungeon. We're going through with Shion and Cosmos. We also have a little tutorial hub at first if we want to learn how to attack the battle system, stuff we've already talked about here. You can also just skip it and go right into testing. Towards the end, after we get to the very end, things start to get unstable in the Encephalon. Alan and the team back on the ship are freaking out. I don't think we introduced Alan. He's just one of the team leads. He's into Shion. But doesn't have the courage to ask her out. It's played for laughs. He's the comic relief. Everybody clowns on Alan. But he's freaking out because this is unstable. Shion will not leave. And this is where we get to test the Hilbert effect, which in this universe, I think that's a real thing. Like, it's named after a real scientist, but the Hilbert effect in this universe draws the Gnosis, this is what we were just talking about, draws the Gnosis from their plane into ours. And we're using it here against the simulated Gnosis. And when Cosmos begins to do this, warning lights and sirens go off, like things are breaking down, visual corruption is on the walls, like, because this is a computer simulation. And the team tries to shut the whole thing down because Shion's in danger. Shion overrides it because she needs this data. She doesn't care about her own safety. She needs the data. She's a scientist. And they keep getting freaked out because they keep referencing it's happening again, just like before. So there was a tragedy before that we're going to become familiar with. But right before Shion gets pulled out, the audio fades, and Shion walks up to this Gnosis that's disappearing, shrouded in gold light. From the light, we see this young red-haired girl dressed in white looking at Shion. They look pretty similar, but they're very clearly not the same person. And Shion cannot look away. But right before anything can happen, Alan pulls her back out. This reminds me instantly of the Ellie situation in Xenogears, which, too much to get into there, but we saw something pretty similar to this in Xenogears with the main character, Ellie. We are going to see this girl a lot as time moves on with Shion. But right now, Shion gets pulled out. She's safe. She's back onto the ship. Alan saved her. Alan's like, "Oh, Chief, you always do this to me," or whatever he says in his bumbling little way. And we're all good now. Shion does not tell him about the girl, though. What was your first thoughts when you saw the girl in white?
We're gonna get some Xenogears shit.
Oh yeah.
That's all I could. I mean, if you want me to be honest, like, this is a character we're gonna have to pay attention to because this is gonna be central to plot and narrative revelations. I mean, I hate to be that like basic about it, but that was my initial thoughts. Here's plot element, here's narrative building. We're not gonna know anything about her until later, but put it in the back of your mind.
100% on the level with that. I feel like that she's very clearly that anime character that you see that you don't know who it is yet, but it's going to be very, very important to the progression of the main character and how they're going to navigate the story. And I also think that, just as a side note too, I think she reminded me of the beginning of this game. And because the beginning of this game started thousands of years ago, I feel like she might be directly relevant to that. So we'll see.
We will see. We learn who she is in this game, so that's nice.
Okay.
We get to see another section of the ship now, and we're introduced to Commander Cherenkov. He's going to be a major player here too. He's been on edge since we picked up, quote, that strange object 10 days ago, which we can kind of put two and two together. It's the Zohar that we saw getting picked up earlier. Everybody's been on edge. Their original orders from the Galaxy Federation were to investigate the vanished planet. There's a planet that just vanished, and assist the researchers. But the strange object that they picked up seems to have been some sort of an audible. They saw it and they knew they needed to take it, and other factions want it too. There are rumors that are circling about a casualty upon retrieving it too. This is obviously the man that disappeared, right? The astronaut that disappeared when they touched it. This is also where we learn about the trump card, which is how they refer to Cosmos. That's the data that we've been gathering. We have to present it to the captain and to Cherenkov. It's already extremely behind schedule. They reference the casualty that happened 2 years ago as well. It's pretty clear that Cherenkov here has history with Cosmos, and it doesn't seem positive. People speak about Cosmos in hushed tones. They see her as a killing machine, and we learn why, but nobody is comfortable about this, really, except for Shion. And this is where we get essentially part 2 of our tutorial, where we get to explore the whole ship. This is a huge part of Xenosaga, so you take your time doing it. This is where we get our UMN tutorial with our little bunny friend, where we get introduced to the email system. There are lots of emails in this game where you can get plugins for Cosmos, and there's a whole investing side quest that gives you, I think, a really, really good item or ability eventually. It's really important. Answer your emails. Answer your goddamn emails.
My inbox is too full. I'm sorry, Rick. I can't do it. I can't do it.
I do think it's really cute that they use the email system to give you advertisements for other Namco games.
Yeah, like Tekken, right? Don't they have a Tekken email?
Time Crisis.
Yeah.
Kazuya is canonically in this universe, yeah.
Play your PlayStation 2 games in 6000 AD.
Yeah. There's a throwaway line that funerals are a thing of the past here, but Tekken, that's forever.
Tekken is forever.
There are several references to other Namco titles in here. It's great.
Yeah.
I also like that it's not strictly related to the emails, but the UMN database is this kind of in-world dictionary that'll give you, it'll explain. It's kind of like the data log in Final Fantasy 13 or the active time system in 16. It talks to you like you're the player. It doesn't talk to you like you're Shion. It'll reference the fact that you're playing Xenogears, Xenosaga. It'll mention the developers, or I don't know. I thought it was cute.
I do want to, while we're on the emails, I do want to say that For the most part, I like the emails. I think they're cute. I think they're a nice little addition. I like them in other games too, like Front Mission 3, I think does a really good job. It reminded me a lot of the email system that you do get in Front Mission 3. I think it's a nice little system that you got here. What I don't like about the email system is in order to get some emails, you have to do specific things and go to specific places in between specific events in chapters in order to trigger some of these email chains. That kind of sucks, especially because that's some of the ways you can get some of your good items, or you can get some of your monies to spend on stuff that, like eggs that you probably won't use. But like that's how you get a lot of that information is like, you need to go into this building and into this square next to this person in chapter whatever, or in between this part and this part while this is happening. And there's like no rhyme or reason why you should do that. So in that aspect, like the email system can be a pain in the ass, but I do like it regardless.
And it's surprisingly, the little AI mascot, it's a little bunny, is not at all what you expect it to be, like in the universe. And you can go through the game without knowing what it is, but it gets wild. That's all I'm going to say for now.
That's a word for it.
So speaking of that incident, we keep mentioning the incident. We get a flashback pretty briefly of Shion thinking about 2 years ago. She's working late at night with this man who we learn is named Kevin, and later we learn that that's her boyfriend. I don't think that's a spoiler. This is just kind of showing where Shion was at that time. They're kind of debating. They're like, I don't know what to say when Cosmos wakes up. What do I say to her? And he's like, I haven't been getting any sleep because of this. And Shion's like, why don't you just say good morning? And he's like, wow, thank you. That's it. Like, I'm good now. What? What the fuck?
That makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Really?
Treat her like treat her like a human. Treat her like you normally would.
But I mean, he's like, well, what do I say? I haven't gotten any sleep. Like, this is racking my brain. What about good morning? Well, that does it. I can sleep sound now.
It's like some of those situations where you are thinking way too hard about something, and then all of a sudden someone tells you the answer, and the answer is probably the most obvious thing you can do. And all of a sudden you're like, oh, yeah, it's like getting the best answer, the most obvious and simple answer, and just coming to the realization that, yeah, that's all I really need to do. That makes a lot easier. It's just like, I don't have to think about this anymore. So I can understand that. Is it entirely realistic? No, but I understand the premise. Like,
all right.
He is going way too deep into something because he's probably almost thinking of Cosmos as like a god. Like, I'm about to talk to a god.
Yeah.
What do you say to a god?
Right.
And Shion is just like looking at it like, this is like just our creation. This is the first time she's meeting anybody. Just say hi.
So on that note,
yeah, when you put it that way.
On that note, though, I am curious. So we're to understand that Cosmos is a brand new piece of machinery, technically, at this point. She and that the activation on the Wongolid is the first time that she's actually been conscious.
That's what we're led to believe, but we don't have all the information yet.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, we learn more about the incident the more we go on. The short answer is no. She has been awake before.
And you really don't get all that information in this game either.
Right. Yeah. Shortly after, we do get another couple of scenes here. Bookending this dream with, or flashback with Kevin, we're introduced to Vanderkam, who is, in this universe, is OSHA's worst nightmare. When we see him, he is just beating the shit out of his employees and calling them slackers.
Listen up! You lazy bums are the cause of that accident! You're not getting any time to confess your sins, though. Why not? Because I'm not giving it to you. If you got time to be sorry, you got time to get your ass in gear. If you got time to think, you got time to get your fingers moving. Don't even start thinking you got a brain to think with. You're gonna become machines and work like them day and night. You're all a bunch of slackers.
Boy, I guess not every department's run like ours.
A pretty clear reference to Vanderkam from Xenogears. It's like the same guy, just with a different face tattoo. We see that, then she has the daydream about Kevin, and when she snaps out of it, she's standing in front of the Zohar Shion is. and she is just transfixed by it. And we hear this dinging sound. Again, this is something that was in Xenogears too. All color just goes inverse for a second. And then we see this image of a rotating necklace back and forth, going like it's hypnotizing you. And we hear the dinging again. And then we see the little girl in white in front of the Zohar. And immediately Shion is transported to an outdoor cemetery with the Zohar tall in the center. Everything's in black and white. The girl in white, who is now wearing the necklace that we just saw, speaks, but no audio is present, and vanishes into the Zohar. Shion then approaches and reaches out, and when she touches it, the Zohar ripples like water. This is all extremely cryptic, and I don't think we're meant to know what is going on here. There is a clear there's a clear relationship between Shion, this girl, and the Zohar, though. They're linked, and we don't know why yet. But she snaps out of it when Vanderkam shouts at her, and she almost gets hit by some rotating machinery. He calls her a bimbo and tells her to get the fuck out, and promptly punches another guy in the face nearby just because he feels like it, which is awesome and cool.
Watch it, you slacker! Only authorized personnel are allowed up here. I've had 3 people vanish on me already. Get the hell out of here! My men will start slacking off. They see bimbos like you around.
I'm so sorry.
Who's the idiot that let civilians on this ship? What the hell are you staring at? Oh.
I do want to take a moment to talk about how, even up until this point and afterwards, this game, it is 2003, okay, so contextualized, and it is Japan, but like the writing in this game is really, really misogynistic. Like they do not treat, like Shion is almost at every interaction with a male character in this game at various points looked down on, talked down to, or sexually or verbally harassed in various ways. And it made me super uncomfortable when I was playing this game. And I mean, I have certain tolerances for that if I'm playing something in the privacy of, my own space and stuff like that. Obviously, I understand it and I look at it for the context of what it is, but I was streaming it and it was shocking to me how this was very, very poorly aged, and it didn't necessarily make me feel very comfortable streaming that to an audience. So I did just want to make a point of that, just for listeners, if that is something that's bothering you. Just be aware of when this came out and how they treat characters. Do you agree with me? I'm not too off base on this.
I'm not saying you're wrong, but that's not an alarm bell of mine that went off outside of maybe this comment. I interpret it more as Shion being spoken down to because she was an underling and not at a high-ranking position. Maybe I didn't see it so much as misogyny. I'm not saying that that's a wrong take, but for me, my scales didn't tip that way.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
Sure.
I don't think you're wrong, though.
I'm more on the same wavelength as Rick. Now, the comment I could understand, definitely that perspective, and that maybe I just didn't, see more of that you may have seen. But what I viewed it as is that these were some scientists on the ship, that these are military people that she's dealing with, and I think she's a civilian. They're not military. So, as someone who's in the military, that we don't call random girls bimbos. At least, not the time that I've been in, maybe a little bit before, but I'm just joking, by the way. Like when you're dealing with civilians, especially people who aren't associated with what you're doing. And I think this is the same for any work situation. If you're dealing with people that aren't necessarily in your field and you're told that you have to cater to these people and they need to be treated differently than the way that you treat your own people, You're going to have some sort of resentment to them inherently. So there's these people that are on this military vessel that are part of a big corporation that is building some secret weapon that you're not allowed to do, and you're doing everything for them, but you're not allowed to know anything that they're doing. You're supposed to treat them differently. You're supposed to treat them special, and that could just be part of the inherent frustration. That's really what was more of the vibe that I was getting. Mm-hmm. The fact that she was a woman probably did trigger that bimbo comment, which definitely I could see where you're coming from on that. But I also saw through a lot of the other ship when she would talk to certain other characters that she was treated with respect outside of the military personnel that she was talking to.
I will say too, another place I can see it, Nick, is there's a time in the future where Shion is aboard a ship and she's the only woman, so she just kind of gets relegated to cooking and cleaning, and everybody just kind of expects it, and they're just like, yeah, that's normal. Like, we've never had good food before because we don't have women on this ship. That point, I was like, that's weird. Like, I don't like that, you know?
Yeah. And I mean, it was this point where I started recognizing it, where it's like casual misogyny. It's not like capital M where it's like women are being treated less than in this entire like thing. But there's a later on in this section when you start learning more characters that are on the Gleaned, and there's like a blonde antagonist that's kind of at this point, and he like kind of gropes Shion in a way that is, or it not, it is Shion. It might be a Realian that he might have done that too. But there are moments where it was just like, there's that. And then there's the way that Shion is treated, especially when she's brought aboard the other ship, that kind of, those are all the pieces together that made me be like, wow, this is a little bit uncomfortable, especially in terms of like the aging of those character interactions.
I know the scene you're talking about. I'm pretty sure it's a Realian, and I think that has different implications based on his background. Also, I think the Realian was a boy, but I don't know that for sure.
Really? Okay. Gotcha.
I think it'll be interesting to keep that lens open, though, as we progress through the story.
Yeah.
Because I want to reiterate, I'm not telling you that you're wrong.
Oh, no, for sure. For sure.
So we are right before the Realian scene, which is where we are going to end for the day, which will be a great starting point because it is a really wild scene that introduces one of the craziest concepts in this game, DME addiction. But for today, we have talked about so much, and there's so much to marinate on. This series is going to go into so many different areas that I'm really excited to talk about regarding the mysticism and the Abrahamic religions, and then just this idea of fear and character, what characters are going through. I'm really excited to get through it. For today, I think that's going to be all. So I want to thank Nick and Chris once more for being here. Obviously, I knew they were the right folks for the job, and I'm glad that they said yes. So we'll do full self-promotion, maybe the beginning of next episode, the end of the whole series, I don't know. But I do want to tell everybody to check out Friday Night Gamecast and Retro Hangover. They are two very good quality shows. Any recommendations on where they could start if they're new listeners?
Absolutely. So if you want to start with us, we're the Friday Night Gamecast on all podcasting platforms. And we just started with our episode 50, the new entry into season 3, and we talk about our experiences at PAX East 2024, and we did some Dragon's Dogma 2 impressions. So if you're in the zeitgeist of all of the current games that are out right now, you feel free to jump in. But we also have another episode that I thought was probably one of our best, and that was our Game of the Year 2023, which is what we capped off on at the end of season 2. So please go check out both.
Definitely do. What about Retro Hangover, Chris?
Oh, I have no idea a point to tell people where to start with that. But if you can find all our stuff over our Linktree, which is linktr.ee/retrohangover. Our most popular episode of all time is Silent Hill, the first one. That's not exactly the episode I necessarily recommend, but that's what people like. But if I could pick a personal favorite, it's probably Silent Hill 2. I mean, that's what everyone seems to like. I really had a good time enjoying that. That was from a few years ago, though, so I just want to say that. Always just suggest, hey, give the most recent episode a listen, whatever that might be at this point. And if you like what you hear, it's either a Flight, which is a top 5 episode, or it's a more mainline episode. And if you like it, hey, stick around, because that's usually where we're going at the time. So if you do stop by there, deeply appreciate it. But Rick's been on our show with Final Fantasy VI. That's also a good place to go start for our show, I would think, because Rick's always a good time. And of course, that should be a nice introduction. If you have not already listened to the fantastic series that myself and Rick are on with Final Fantasy VI here on Pixel Project Radio, you should definitely go check that out, because man, did I have a blast recording that. So thank you, Rick, once again, because I'm going to plug that every single opportunity I have.
Yeah, you can all find all of these links in the show notes to Retro Hangover and to Friday Night Gamecast, Dragon's Dogma 2, Silent Hill 2. You can find all of that in the episode description, links to their socials, links to their episodes, and more. Definitely check it out. You can find our stuff in there as well. I'm not going to go as heavy on the self-promo throughout these series because it's going to be every single time, but that's okay. You can find everything in the episode description. Check it out at your leisure. With that, I think we have enough to marinate on until next time, where we start getting into more of the thick plot of this game. So, thank you all for sticking around to the very end. Until next time, my name is Rick, as always. We're signing out for now. Take care.